My name is Dr. Miriam Niven and I have the honour of being on the faculty and administrative team here at Glucksman Ireland House New York University. I also have the pleasure of working on the Archives of Irish America oral history project with my colleagues. It's a great night for the women here tonight, I'm really happy to say. My colleagues are here. One of whom you're going to hear from in a minute, and I know Ide won't mind me stealing the limelight a little bit on the archives just to draw attention. So Ide O'Carroll is a visiting scholar here as part of our initiative, and my colleagues Marion and Linda, would you mind just Marion Casey and Linda Dowling Almeida, and Danielle Zach, who also works on the project, is here. Oh, she's here in front of me.
So everybody can see the team for a second. You want me to come up here? Yeah.
So over the last 10 years, we've been collecting interviews on all aspects of Irish American life. We now have 360 interviews collected, and it's 10 years old, this collection. So my colleague Marion Casey is going to just show us a flavour in terms of the images of the people who've contributed to this archive. And I just want to take this opportunity. She hates the limelight and she'll hate me for doing this, but Marion Casey is the person behind the Archives of Irish America and what she has done in terms of a legacy for future scholars. We should be shouting more from the rooftops, and she doesn't do that enough herself, so I'm taking this opportunity and I want to boot them up.
Thank you, Miriam, but truly it's a communal effort, and I mean that in the best sense of the word. Everybody, many of you in this room have helped create the Archives of Irish America and this oral history project. What I'm going to show you is 4 minutes, and it's just less than 25% of the 360 oral histories that we have done over the last 10 years. And we intentionally did not put names. You may recognize people. The thing that struck me in putting it together is there are so many types of Irish faces, and that diversity is reflected in all the life stories that they have shared with us, and very generously shared. And also, several of the people that we interviewed have passed, so in some ways this is in memoriam for them too. I just have to get the lights here for a second. let me just add that they didn't just smile for the camera. In almost every situation, there has been a mutual joy in the intimacy of the oral history process. And towards the end, where you saw multiple people in the pictures, a lot of those were our students, undergraduate students, who were mentored in the oral history process. And all those are archived as well. So thank you.
Okay, good evening. Thank you all for being here. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker. I realized I've known Ide for, I don't want to say how many years. We were both working in the 1980s in the area of the New Irish research, New Irish immigration, and I met Ide at several conferences and used her book extensively in my own research. Since the time she published the first edition of her book, she's gone on to create an international consulting firm where she's worked with with individuals and larger corporations on both sides of the Atlantic, performing tailored social research and drawing on her background as a researcher and as an oral historian. She lives in Amherst, Massachusetts, and Lismore, Ireland. I'm very jealous of her living situation because she gets to be on both sides of the Atlantic at the best times of the year. What goes around comes around. We're very fortunate now I am at least, and I'm sure all of us share the feeling that she's back working with us again. Since 2013, she's been a visiting scholar, helping us add to our oral history collection, updating her own work and talking with some of some of her more recent work, talking to some of the immigrants who we first studied in the 1980s as undocumented or Donnelly visa immigrants who returned to Ireland, and getting them to share their experiences about what that was like. So it's with very great pleasure that I'm able to introduce Ide tonight and congratulate her for the revision and the updated publication of her book and the 25th anniversary of the original book, the original work that she turned out, and one of my favorite book covers of all time. So thank you very much for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Down the screen. Okay. It's supposed to be.
Táim thar bheith bríomh go léir as 8 sa nacht go háire an talamh Marion Casey, an talamh Linda Dowling Almeida, Miriam, Joe, agus muintir Illig áras Glucksman Ireland Ollscoil New Áireach. Go bhfuil an buíochas faoi le a go bháil le Michaela Annie Rogers an sa chun tosaigh, agus Aliantóirí Maeve O'Mahony, Ashtóir den Sco, agus Paintéir Lisa O'Donnell, agus Macharda Illig, fáilte roimh go léir an Satnacht. I am deeply grateful to each of you for attending this US launch of my book. In particular, I want to express my thanks to Professor Marion Casey and her colleagues here at Glucksman Ireland House. Ireland House has become an important research base for me as I worked on the Oral History Project, and I want to acknowledge and appreciate the support of colleagues on that team: Marion, Linda, Miriam and Danielle. I would also like to acknowledge sociologist Dr. Ide Gray, who wrote a wonderful introduction to the Models for Movers book. As my PhD advisor, she mentored me during the research process I completed for my current book, Irish Transatlantics. I think of Irish Transatlantics as a companion volume to the model's work, because it brings the story of Irish-US migration up to the 21st century and includes the narratives of men as well as women, many of whom I've re-interviewed for the Archives of Irish America Oral History project here at NYU. Irish Transatlantics will be published in 2017. Maria O'Donovan of Cork University Press has been my angel on this publishing journey. She and her colleague, Mike Collins, have been a pleasure to work with, even from afar. A very special word of thanks now to my partner of 21 years, now my spouse, Annie Rogers, for her continued support of my writing and my research. Guramila Mahagat, Annie. Now to thank the two young Irish women for participating in tonight's event. Galway painter Lisa O'Donnell, here in the front row, contacted me last year when she was in New York City, and I am glad she did. She painted the beautiful cover image based on a photograph of Bridget Kennedy in the Models collection. Lisa travelled from London to be with us tonight in order to exhibit her new paintings here on the wall, work supported by a grant from Culture Ireland. May I also mention that they are for sale, and if you'd like to talk to Lisa, but I've bought the one that was the cover image, so I snagged it. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks also to actor Maeve O'Mahony from Waterford, also here in the front, a recent graduate of Trinity College, Dublin's Drama School, who will be a resident in New York for this year under the J1 post-graduation visa. Maeve devised this one-woman performance based on the model's voices. Thank you, Maeve. Both Lisa and Maeve have participated in the Irish launch of the book at Trinity College, Dublin, in June, when Minister for Diaspora Affairs, Jimmy Deanahan, TD, and Professor Margaret Kelleher of UCD did the formal honours. Maeve and Lisa's careers are only taking off. Remember their names and remember where you met them first. They represent the current generation of the Irish diaspora. Finally, this book would not have been possible without the cooperation of so many Irish women immigrants. To all of them, living and dead, I acknowledge my deep gratitude. I would now like to give you some background to the Models Project, explain my motive for embarking on this journey over 25 years ago, then describe the Irish Transatlantics work as a way of illustrating my current research and writing on Irish-US migration. Maeve will then perform her piece on the Models' voices, and we can, at the end, open the floor up for questions. So that's the format. Welcome. This book was written more than a quarter of a century ago when I was a young, fiery feminist, I hope I still am, shocked by the absence of Irish women's voices in the terms of Irish migration. At the time, there were very few primary sources available on Irish women immigrants in the United States of America. I saw oral history as a suitable source to fill this gap, a way of facilitating women with busy work and family commitments to document the story of their lives. Women with little time to write journals or correspond with family in Ireland. By conducting this oral history project, I sought to respect Irish women's right to narrate their histories in their own words, and also address the imbalance that existed in the general story of Irish emigration to the United States. The book emerged from a research project I completed for a master's degree in history, undertaken with the guidance of the late Professor Ruth Ann Harris, when she was Director of Irish Studies at Northeastern University in Boston. Like me, Ruth Ann was an Irish Studies outlier. If I was the feminist with persistent questions that began with, "Where are the women?" she was the Protestant, as equally attuned to the exclusion of that experience in general accounts of the Irish in America. Born to missionary parents in Liberia and raised in Canada, she initially became interested in Ireland because of her marriage to the economist John Harris of the Harris-Toledo migration model, whose ancestors were Protestants from Donegal. In her scholarly work on Irish immigration, Ruth Ann sought out the orange as well as the green, and questioned representations of the Irish at home and abroad. As my guide on this academic journey, her generosity knew no bounds. She opened her library, her home, and her heart to this immigrant. I dedicate the reissuing of models for movers to Ruth Ann's memory and to the memory of my mother, Maeve O'Carroll. My mother encouraged me to emigrate, to follow in my grandfather Dennis Flaherty's footsteps and spend time in America. She wrote to me weekly in the old-fashioned way with pen and paper because telephone calls were out of the question, just way too expensive. Since I'd given up a teaching job in Ireland to attend graduate school in America, her support was crucial, as was her belief in the value of recording Irish women's histories in their own words. When I began my graduate studies in history in the mid-1980s, I was already in my late 20s, a seasoned campaigner for women's rights in Ireland, someone who had held down a job for 7 years. Prior to this journey of inquiry, my thinking had been greatly influenced by the writings of American feminists. Women like the poet Adrienne Rich, the African-American folklorist Zora Neale Hurston, the writers Alice Walker and Kate Millett, the theologian Mary Daly, to name but a few. At graduate school in America, I had the gift of time to immerse myself in a literature that was new to me, the world of history. What I discovered was both shocking and exciting. Historical texts clearly demonstrated a tendency to either ignore women completely or include them in general accounts of the human experience. In Gerda Lerner's works, Why History Matters and the Creation of Patriarchy, she even argued for a new field of study, women's history, based on a critical gender analysis in order to challenge the dominant male historical narrative. Her confident interrogation of history's lack inspired and encouraged me to look anew at the Irish immigration literature with the same critical eye. If, as I concluded, history was actually an act of creation drawing on available sources, then I too could create a narrative for future generations. Emboldened by Gerda Lerner's arguments and her call for a critical gender analysis of history, I reviewed the literature at the time and concluded, as she had, that there was indeed a dominant gendered narrative. Therefore, there were gaps to be addressed by new scholars like me, interested in a wider, more inclusive history of US immigration. The more I delved, the more I realized that the omission of women's experience could be seen as either an injustice I could get upset about, or an opportunity to be taken by me and addressed. And in the case of Irish women immigrants, the United States, my area of interest, there was certainly work to be done. With Ruth Ann's guidance, I set to. Let me offer some baseline conclusions from that period that informed my research process as I gathered oral histories of Irish women immigrants in America. During the three main waves of emigration from Ireland in the 19th century, before, during and after the Great Famine of the 1840s, America was the main destination for Irish immigrants. But from the 1920s onwards, after US immigration quotas were introduced, Britain became the destination of choice for those leaving Ireland during the 20s, 50s and 80s. After the famine, more women than men emigrated to America. As Jewish American historian Hasia Diner of this parish explained in her Aaron's Daughters in America, Irish women in America supported female relatives and friends in Ireland to emigrate. They created a unique pattern of female chain migration that continued into the 20th century. The two other dominant ethnic groups coming to America after the 1840s, the Eastern European Jews and Italians, usually emigrated in family groups. Therefore, Irish women, aware of scant opportunities at home and the possibilities in America, enabled one another to emigrate. Another important finding for me was the fact that in the majority of cases, immigration history focused on the experience of immigrants in the host or the new country. I was of the view that we needed to consider conditions in the home country if we were to truly discern the reasons why Irish women left during particular decades in the 20th century. In each of the chapters in the Models book, therefore, I explore the socio-economic, political and religious dimensions to the role of women in Irish society during the decades that I look at, the 20s, the 50s and 80s, and then present the oral histories of the women immigrants. And what was life like for women in Ireland during these three waves of immigration in the 20th century? My conclusion was that throughout much of the 20th century, Irish society held deeply conservative views in relation to women and their role. Despite women's involvement in the Easter Rising of 1916 and the Civil War of 2022, the Irish Constitution of 37 defined women's primary role as within the home. In the early part of the 20th century, huge numbers of women supported the small farm economy through their unpaid work. Nora Joyce from Inishmaan, the Aran Islands, whom Lisa has rendered so beautifully here in this painting, if you can see it, a 1920s immigrant to America whose oral history and photographs form such a compelling part of the Models book, describes the realities of relentless work inside and outside the home. Another 1920s emigrant, Winifred Geary, describes watching her mother pregnant year after year, knowing that the arrival of each baby was a strain on everyone, a presence that meant more work for her. Lack of paid employment in agriculture or industry such as it was proved to be a catalyst for emigration in Ireland in the 20s, a story replicated in the 50s during a particularly bleak economic time. Out of a population of less than 3 million in the Republic, about 500,000 left Ireland. While the economic conditions drove Irish men as well as women from Ireland's shores, I argue that women's emigration in the 50s was complicated by the prevailing social mores that limited opportunity and restricted their choices at home. I offer as evidence the example of the Mother and Child healthcare scheme to illustrate Ireland's failure to enact legislation that had the potential to directly impact positively on women's lives. That scheme, to provide maternity care for all mothers and health care for children up to the age of 16 years, caused major controversy and public debate. The combined forces of Catholic Church and conservative male power elite blocked what was a progressive and life-enhancing scheme, denied Irish women the right to manage their own reproductive capacity. In the Models book, Terry Ryan describes the harsh conditions she endured growing up in inner city Dublin in a tenement in the 1950s, the fierce poverty, her battle as a child with TB, a disease that was rampant in Ireland at the time. The women who left Ireland for America during the economic recession of the 1980s had the benefit of a greater level of education than had been available to earlier generations. But they had also lived through two highly divisive referenda campaigns, including one on divorce. In many ways, the 1980s women seemed better equipped for the move than previous generations. And yet, as undocumented aliens or illegals, many Irish women placed these homes at the doorsteps of the homes within which they worked as nannies and cleaners, taking up the work of earlier generations, the Bridgets of the past. This cohort included women like Sister Lena Deavy. Her work with the poor in Ballymun in Dublin led her to take a courageous pro-divorce stance in the referendum, an act that resulted in a nasty backlash. Sister Lena's oral history provides wonderful insights into this period in Ireland, her interpretation of social justice, and how that guided her faith and her work. A legal immigrant herself in America, Lena ended up working on behalf of those 1980s New Irish who were illegal. In general then, the oral histories of Irish women in the Models book recount stories of scarcity and scant opportunities in Ireland in the 20s, 50s and 80s. They also describe how each woman created an independent life for herself in America in the face of multiple challenges here. As active agents supporting one another to leave Ireland, These Irish women are role models because they inspire us all to have the courage to act. In America, they carved out new lives and possibilities for themselves in a place that enabled them to thrive and enrich the quality of their lives. Nora Joyce from the 1920s followed in the footsteps of countless other Irish women in America by working in domestic service until she had managed to save enough money to buy a house, marry and start her own family. Largely self-educated during spells in TB hospitals, Terry Ryan from the 1950s nonetheless found work as a secretary in America. She graduated with a degree from Northeastern University shortly before her husband and the father of her 2 children became its president. On the pretext of taking a rest, Sister Lena Deavy from the 80s applied to and later graduated from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She became one of Boston's most respected Irish leaders. By combining a critical analysis of conditions for women in Ireland with women's own accounts of life at the time, my aim in the Models book was to highlight the sheer necessity of emigration. Its survival in Ireland was a tough proposition, especially for women, a place where patriarchs in family, church and state controlled women's lives, where education and paid work was limited. Then America provided a lifeline to a relative freedom and, crucially, an opportunity to earn an independent income. After reading Models for Movers, we begin to appreciate just how far Irish society has come. And after this summer, I have to say just how far Irish society has come. Once Models for Movers was published in 1990, others supported what was then considered a novel approach to Irish immigration history. People who, like Ruth Ann, recognised the rich vein that oral histories offered as an accompaniment to the often stark picture presented by numbers alone. I met the late Susan von Sales of Schlesinger Library when I was a student at Harvard. She arranged for the tapes and papers relating from Models for Movers to be housed at what is the premier archive on the history of women in America. It was Susan who named it the O'Carroll Collection. For a small book, hastily put together to meet an attic deadline, because the original manuscript somehow got lost en route to the printers in Guernsey. This is in the pre-personal computer days. And I was working waitressing on the Cape with Shin Scéal. It seemed to pack a punch, this little book. Unquestionably, the original publication needed a thorough editing, something I never got a chance to do. It was my responsibility to ensure that the women's voices were presented in the best possible light. It was, however, my first experience with publishing. In that sense, I hope that this new 25th anniversary edition is an improvement on the original. And we certainly have new photographs as well in this new collection. Regrettably, I did not get to interview Dubliner Bridie Halpin before she died in 1988. Nonetheless, I included her story in Models because it highlighted the argument I wanted to make about the value of using an oral history approach. From the documents we have available to us, we know that Bridie emigrated to the United States bitterly disappointed with the terms of the treaty. From her New York base, she nonetheless continued to work to bring about what she referred to as a proper, quote-unquote, settlement to Irish affairs. We should be able to hear Bridie describe her reasons for going, to understand why she maintained connections with Republican leaders in Ireland. Instead, what we have is a small clutch of papers found in a suitcase under her bed here in New York after her wake. A young revolutionary and an active member of Cumann na mBan, committed to political and social change in Ireland, she was imprisoned in the North Dublin Union and Kilmainham Jail. This was a woman who corresponded with Maud Gonn MacBride. As 2016 approaches, when Ireland will mark the anniversary of the Easter Rising, and NYU is a major player in the lectures and so forth associated with that, I am grateful that we have Bridie's words written in a little booklet she made from scraps of paper, stitched together in prison over 80 years ago. Bridie's words speak to me of her confidence in her political position, her sense of her own agency, and her capacity to effect change even from afar. One excerpt reads, quote, "Never fear for Ireland, for she has soldiers still, up us," unquote. After this book was originally published in 1990, the story of Irish immigration to America continued well into the mid-1990s, a time when more men than women emigrated from Ireland. By the 21st century, however, as a result of Ireland's thriving Celtic Tiger economy, a major shift happened in the story of Irish US migration. Ireland reversed its historic migration pattern. No longer a place of departures, it became a place of arrivals, as people from many nations of the world came in search of work, including Irish migrants returning from America. At this point, I too returned to the topic of Irish US migration after a long hiatus. This time I interviewed Irish men, as well as women, in America and in Ireland, research that forms the basis of my forthcoming book, Irish Transatlantics. For many new Irish, the return to Ireland was justified by the enhanced job opportunities there, but the place of return was vastly different to the place they had left. Now Ireland's population was racially and ethnically diverse as people from Eastern Europe, Africa and Asia sought to make a home there too. By 2003, Ireland was ranked the most globalised nation in the world because of its advanced IT, communications and financial services systems and structures. Corporations in banking and finance established a foothold in the European market there. IT giants like Google availed of Ireland's favourable corporation tax to establish their only base outside of the United States in Dublin's Fair City. Before it all went belly up with the banking and finance crash of 2008, it seemed as though Ireland was surging ever upward economically and that emigration was a curse of the past. But as we know, ní mar a hialtar a bítar. Assumptions are often askew. By 2010, as large numbers of young people started leaving Ireland again, they headed to Canada and Australia, not the United States, because of the strict immigration restrictions introduced here after the 9/11 attacks. As part of the global Irish family, this group of Irish migrants expects to return, even if it has to go again. They are actively engaged in Irish social change processes, as evidenced by their involvement in Ireland's marriage equality referendum in May, when the hashtag #HomeToVote was the #1 trending topic on Twitter. In Irish Transatlantics, we learn how those who were part of this unprecedented Irish migrant experience at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st centuries understand and make sense of it. We can learn a great deal from listening to the new Irish, and thankfully we have many oral histories of this cohort available to us via the Archives of Irish America here at NYU. And once again, I commend Marion Casey for her vision in establishing this archive and for directing this oral history project. The new Irish migrants of the 1980s lived through a period of dramatic structural change that shaped their lives, influenced where they located, where they worked, and how they remained connected to both places, Ireland and America. They also shaped their lives to suit these changed circumstances. Others did too, including elderly parents in Ireland who learned to Skype. Seeing their children and grandchildren on screen is sometimes a blessing, to know that they look healthy and they look well, and sometimes a curse, because it brings back the sense of loss in their lives, because the real, aching, emotional underbelly of distance remains. Many of those in the Irish Transatlantics book are dual Irish US citizens, as are their children, affording them the privilege of future mobility in either direction, if necessary, a hedge against an economic downturn in either place. In this new era, in this new century, established ideas about settlement and assimilation are no longer valid. Ireland has come a long way. The model's women's words remind us just how much Ireland needed to change and just how tough life was for women in our relatively recent past. Many of these women carved out new lives for themselves in America. They aided one another to get here and helped one another while here. Despite being thousands of miles away, however, these women nonetheless retained a strong connection to and deep investment in Ireland and Irish affairs. Similarly, Irish transatlantics maintain and sustain connections to both Ireland and America, facilitated by information technology and communications. This is the new reality of being Irish in a globalized world. Let me finish with a story about the place where I live most of the year, Amherst, Massachusetts, the home of the poet Emily Dickinson. Last year, when the house was being renovated, a number of us were invited to spend time in her bedroom, the place where she composed her work. The collection of poems that emerged from that process is to be launched at the Dickinson Museum on December 12th. During my time alone in the room, I remembered that Emily's servants were all Irish immigrants and imagined the sounds of their voices echoing in the house. One servant in particular was an important friend of Emily's. Her name was Mary Marr, who hailed from South Tipperary, a Gaeltacht area until the late 20s, the home place of my paternal grandfather, Ide O'Carroll. Here is the poem I composed. I'll read it first in Irish and then give you a prose translation. Seomra Bui. Imahile Emily and Seomra Bui. Dan Viog, Galante, Kugelach. Fille Fassa, Gan Faun, File Shoe. Cíaman isteach an bhuineog hawl ag scríomh le peann luaí blúirí ní pápéir, clúdach litrach, cópleabhar scoile, na focail fitte fuite le chéile, na litricha beaga lán de stún faoi nádúr, an saoil agus grás do dé. Tá an tine lasa leistíordat. Lasma tá gachra de bán, is í mosca faoi lebas a chuoine, tá na céite cnúsach dáin. Yellow room, sitting with Emily, here in a little yellow room, a shy woman, a wise poet, reluctant to publish. I see you by the window over, weaving words on scraps of paper, envelopes, little letters full of force. Behind you the fire is burning, outside everything is pure white, and in a box under the bed in the corner, a collection, hundreds of poems. Very mother.
Nora Joyce, 1920s emigrant. At that time, the American consulate was in Dublin. They stripped you, had your clothes checked. They did everything to you. Of course, if you had TB or anything like, or sometimes if they didn't want you, you wouldn't be approved for travel. Sometimes the American government only wanted a certain amount to come at certain times. The exam was maybe a week before you'd travel. Yeah, I couldn't say a word of much English, don't you know. I had some because I learned it working for a spell in Dublin, but if I didn't leave the Aran Islands, I wouldn't even have a yes or a no. It was very hard. Anyway, I was working away with this family in America, and a couple of months into it I left and got a new job, a better job. The new boss, she asked me, "Can you cook?" And I said, "Yes, I can." And then she asked, "Can you make popovers?" And I said, "Yes, I can." And you know, I never made a popover before in my life. I got more dollars there though, from 7 a week to 12. I was 2.5 years there. There were times when I was lonesome. Of course there were. When I worked with one family in the fall, they used to go down to a place near Gloucester. There was a lovely section there, Magnolia it's called. I was upstairs and I could hear the waves coming in at night, and I soaked my pillow. I loved it down there because there was high rocks in one place and you could go and sit there in the broad Atlantic stretching out ahead. It was beautiful. It was an island. When I'd hear the waves coming in, I'd start thinking they were under our house at home in Inishmaan. The States has been good to us. We had 2 houses in Dorchester, one rented out. I enjoy work, always have. 3 hours I work today and I'm 78, would you believe? Working inside of a high-rise apartment in Boston, and I'm in the will there. I don't have to work, but it's good. What would I be doing around the house? It's good for you. Terry Ryan, 1950s immigrant. I was born in Dublin in 1936 on a street that no longer exists, Beaver Street, somewhere off Sheriff Street. I was christened Catherine Teresa Ryan, but because there were 27,000 Catherines in the family, naturally no one called me Catherine. We lived in a Dublin tenement, one of the old Georgian houses. During the slum clearing project, we were moved to the Liberty Hall flats, all 6 of us in a 1-bedroom flat. Later again, we were given a house in Dunkerrin in the suburbs, preferential housing because I had TB. Neither of my parents were very well educated, but they were literate people. They had a depth of knowledge, a breadth of interest. My father sang opera. He was a very bright man, a soldier in the Free State Army who ended up working as a day labourer in England during the Second World War to support us. He died there of pneumonia, and because it was wartime, they wouldn't let my mother bring his body home to Ireland. I think I probably had TB for a lot longer than was actually established. I was a placid child, always tired, and that's the mark of the disease. I left formal education somewhere between the age of 9 and 10, and that's the last time I went to school, until I went to college at Northeastern University in Boston. They sent me to St. Mary's, which had just opened up in the Phoenix Park. From that point on, I can consciously remember saying, nobody else is going to take care of my life, so I'm going to do it. And so I did. The doctors thought I was a stupid inner city kid who didn't know anything because they always talked about me as if I wasn't there. I'd take the chart and read it as soon as I left the room. I knew exactly what was going on. I suspect I didn't oblige them by dying off. My mother had been trudging up to this hospital for years. It was a great hardship. At one stage, a doctor told her, in my presence, she probably won't last long beyond 20. I resented that terribly. I thought, we'll see about that. So I decided to have an operation where they stripped the lining of the infected lung. And I got better after it and even went to secretarial college. I got a job. I saw a movie once that showed pictures of New England in the fall, and I thought, I want to see that. I came to America. In America, I was a sort of housekeeper who took care of the kids for a family on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Before I left Dublin to take the job in America, I remember an aunt from a working class family, like my mother, who, like everyone else, was surprised that I'd survived it all. She was so appalled that I was going to work as a housekeeper in America. In fact, her words to my mother always stuck with me. How could you let her skivvy in somebody else's house when she has the kind of background that she does? To my mother's eternal credit, she said if I had her opportunity, I'd go. I moved to Boston City when a friend of my sister's got me a job and an apartment there. I wanted to be free and flexible, independent. I came to Boston right after the time when it was considered to be very socially upscale to have a secretary who sounded almost British. A lot of people thought my accent was a British accent. The people in Boston generally only know the West of Ireland accent. Eventually, I went to work for Northeastern University because there was the fringe benefit of free tuition. I went to work for the Dean of the College of Business and started taking courses, but got sick again. The TB came back. My whole lung collapsed. I was 13 years over the deadline for croaking. I was alone in my apartment and hemorrhaging very badly. I thought, this is it. They operated in December and I had my left lung taken out. 3 weeks later, I took myself off on a cruise to the Bahamas to heal. I had a wonderful Irish landlady who was very good to me. At that point she said she was going to call the doctor to see if they took out my brain instead of my lung because she thought I was absolutely mad. I went on that cruise, came back and worked a lighter schedule. I was promoted to Secretary of the Office of Executive Administrator. One of the executive administrators was my husband, who became president of Northeastern University in 1988, the year I graduated with my degree. BB, 1980s emigrant. When I was growing up, Finglas had a population of about 15,000, and in the space of 10 years that went to 80,000, a huge influx of families. My own family has a great tradition in Finglas. My mother's side goes way back. My great-grandmother was the Finglas midwife. For most of the girls in my class, their aim was to get married. But I've always been drawn more to women than men, as far back as I can remember. And there was a fear, a general fear in myself against society because I wasn't accepted as a lesbian. I remember in secondary school there was a religion book called The Moral Life, which was meant to be quite liberal. There was a section on relationships. I asked the teacher, how come there's no mention of homosexuality? Her answer was, because it doesn't exist, therefore it is not to be discussed. Later, as a teacher myself, I worried about getting a permanent teaching position. You had to sign the moral contract, and the Catholic Church controlled most of the secondary schools. I had no problem teaching in religious institutions because I believed what I was teaching was good quality and that my sexuality had no bearing on my work performance. Within the school, I had no real difficulty, except at times feeling isolated in faculty rooms when everyone else was talking about marriages and couples. When I came to New York in 1988, I blended into the Irish community there. There was no problem getting work teaching. The Catholic Archdiocese was very short of teachers. I enjoyed teaching, but a year into it I just couldn't handle the numbers. 700 students a week, 9 periods a day. I could barely maintain a good living in New York on the pay. I was becoming a machine. I had to stop. I came to Cape Cod on vacation and decided I had to leave New York. Provincetown is a fishing village by the sea. Looking back at that time, my consumption of alcohol hadn't changed in all the years, but what had changed was the amount it took for me to go over the edge. I'd go into a complete personality change. It's often with minority groups that you'll find addictions. As a gay community, we feel isolated from society. We isolate together, and I think because of this kind of loneliness, I became an alcoholic. In recovery, I see a completely different side, the endless amount of support for people. I always had this thing for the arts, for making things with my hands. Once the drinking took over in my early 20s, most of the creative outlet was gone. I think part of giving up alcohol was that I have to focus my energy. I found a great affinity for working in stained glass and apprenticed in that. I have a small workshop and sell my glass in Boston, in Harvard Square and in Provincetown. I've developed my own very recognisable style. My company is called Glynna, which means beautiful glass in Irish. There's still a fear because of US immigration. America doesn't allow openly gay people into the country. It's another form of being excluded. Being gay is not all my life, but it's a very important part of it. I'll go back to Ireland if they deport me. Like oil lamps, we put them out the back of our houses, of our minds. We had lights newer than, better than, and then a time came, this time, and now we need them, that their possessions may become our power. Thank you.
Oh, should we take some questions? Questions, anyone?
I have a question.
Do you want me to go?
Sure. Just with the, don't remember when we were talking last week, the new movie Brooklyn about a 50s immigrant. I just wondered if you had any comments about that and the portrayal of the young woman by Saoirse Ronan.
I haven't seen the movie yet, but I have read the book. I have read the book, and I'm very connected on social media. So somebody tweeted me immediately after Colm Tóibín had been on the BBC Radio 4, when he announced that there was no history of Irish women's emigration to America and none about the 1950s. So a buddy of mine in Dublin got going on that, and the beauty of Twitter is that you can actually get your message there immediately. I was surprised that a man of such incredible, delicate insight and such a gifted craftsman would have come out with something like that, especially he'd been an editor of McGill magazine for years, so he's very attuned to publications and so forth. So that was a little surprising. But to come back to Brooklyn, another tweet that came to me on the foot of that story was to say, well, if he'd read your book, he should have done a female chain migration ending and had her bring her mother to America with her, which I thought was a very interesting suggestion on the part of a reader who had read Models, clearly, bless her. And, we talked about this, Linda, and there's something about the character that for me was not as compelling as some of the women that I've interviewed from the 50s. So that would be, I think there was
And Mary Costello's book too.
And Mary Costello's book, Academy Street, has a similar, what I would say, interesting and beautifully crafted character. Weak in many respects. And what does that say about how we're presenting portraits of women? And these are creative works and good, that the Brooklyn film is generating a huge interest, which is fantastic. I hope people go out and buy the Models book. Hashtag Brooklyn the movie is the hashtag to put your words in. John Crowley, who directed Brooklyn, another friend tweeted me to say, I sat beside him at her wedding. If I'd known him then, I don't have access to him, but by golly, I'm going to make sure he gets a little earful at Christmas.
In the back there?
I'm very interested, thank you for your work, which is wonderful.
Hang on 2 seconds there, just so the people can hear if you don't mind. Thank you.
I'm interested in some of the implications of chain migration. Does anyone follow through with the thought that there's a kind of matriarchy in the Irish-American experience that grows out of that? Or are there implications about in family life about the segregation of men and women, or the opposite? Has anyone pursued this in terms of living out our lives as women in chain migration families? I certainly have it in my own family, also from Tipperary.
Right. And what was your experience? Because tell me what your experience was, because we can hear this.
Really, I've thought about the question, and I don't know that I'm an anything I can articulate about it, but I somehow feel it's terribly important. As I pass on the tea set that belonged to my great grandmother to the nieces and nephews coming along, I know it matters enormously, but I haven't myself been able to articulate that experience just yet. It certainly made me, I think, a very independent woman, for whatever that's worth.
Right.
Well, maybe we'll go adjourn, like all good Irish gatherings, it'll end with a glass of wine, or maybe not always wine, but there's a glass of wine downstairs, and Ide, the book is for sale outside. Actually, it's a great Christmas gift, right?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And she didn't ask me to say that, but our NYU bookstore colleagues are outside selling it, and I'm sure Ide will sign copies. And thank you so much. It was a great evening. Thank you so much, and thank you, Ide.